Makes Me Wanna Holler by Nathan McCall. Chapter 24. Home. The house was completely quiet when we walked in. There was no one there but my mother and me. She left me to my thoughts during the emotional ride from St. Bridges. When we entered the living room, she broke the silence and tried to lighten the heaviness of those fragile first moments home. Well, boy, you finally made it out of that place. Yeah, Ma, I made it out. I kept walking to the back of the house. I could hardly talk. It was too risky. Talking would bring on another tearful breakdown. I needed to be alone. I dropped my belongings in my old bedroom, went into the bathroom, and ran hot water into the tub. It had been nearly 3 years since I'd been allowed to take a bath. In all that time, it had been showers, always showers, in a large tiled room with 10 or more nozzles and as many loud, funky hard heads moving about. Now I could close the bathroom door and shut out the world. I could lock it and nobody would care. I climbed into the tub, sank down low, and let the water creep up to my chin. With eyes closed, I sat there, soaking, thinking, taking in the profound pleasure of it all. I tried my new reality on for size in 100 different ways. Home. I'm actually home. They let me out. I made parole. If I want, I can get up now and walk out that front door and nobody will care. I can walk down the street and around the corner and won't get written up. I can go to the store. I can talk on the phone. I can ride a bus. I'm home. It felt surreal, like an out-of-body experience. Like maybe I was daydreaming it all from a cell in the C3 building at Southampton and might be awakened any minute by the sound of jangling keys or chattering inmates. But all I heard was the deep quiet of the house and the occasional soothing ripple of warm water splashing against my skin, flapping against the side of the tub. In those first few weeks, I wore the consciousness of my new freedom like an overcoat. While riding a bus or walking through a crowded mall, it would dawn on me. I just got out of prison. I did 3 years, now I'm out. I never said it to people, but I felt it in every interaction and thought it at the oddest times, especially when learning new things and relearning old things. There were readjustments to make. Being around elderly people, children, and dogs, walking through the aisles of grocery stores, seeing all those beautiful, wonderful women walking around, free and accessible. Several times I tested my freedom to verify it. I got out of bed late at night and walked through Cavalier Manor, just because I could. No guards came running, no whistles blew, no bells sounded. Nothing. It was real. I was home. For a long time, everything felt alien, like one of those movies where a person is frozen in a block of ice, and when it thaws, he discovers he's in the same place but in a different time. It seemed I was moving about at a different pace than the rest of the world. Like for 3 years, the world had been speeding ahead while I had stood still. The first time I went through a checkout line at Earl's Supermarket on Victory Boulevard, the clerk passed my items over a computerized scanner, which I had never seen. I was fascinated. It made me feel like I'd been locked away 100 years. The first time I stepped out into traffic scared me to death. It never occurred to me before that you had to consciously think to gauge and measure the speed of oncoming cars before crossing the street. Of course, the fashion changes were constant reminders of how long I'd been gone. The platform shoes and bell-bottom pants in my closet just wouldn't cut it. Mama gave me some money and I brought a pair of soft, thin-heeled shoes and a blue, flare-leg denims, and I wore them till they nearly fell off. I knew I was seriously out of it when I ran across Slick. Walking down Cavalier Boulevard, I saw him across the ditch, pimping in the opposite direction toward the 7-Eleven. Slick was a little lightweight chump when I left the streets. Now his frame had filled out and he was strutting hard, like an old head. I yelled across the ditch to him and threw up my clenched fist in a black power salute. Slick raised his hand similarly, but flashed a different sign. 2 of his 3 middle fingers were tucked under, like a partial fist. The pinky and index fingers stood upright like antlers on a deer. After flashing that sign, Slick turned and bopped away. Later, I demonstrated the sign to my brother Dwight and asked, "What does that mean?" He said, "Oh, that's the P-Funk sign." P-Funk? You know, Parliament Funkadelic. Parliament Funkadelic was the hottest new black music group on the scene. I'd heard a few of their tunes on the radio at St. Bridges, but still wasn't fully hip. Dwight showed me a picture of the group on the album cover. They looked wild and crazy, like a black rock group. I thought, damn, when I left the streets, people were doing the black power salute. Now they flashing the P-Funk sign. These niggas going crazy. There were also tense moments that taught me how much I'd really been affected emotionally by the whole prison ordeal. Shortly after I got my license renewed, I was driving my stepfather's Mercury Comet down Portsmouth Boulevard when the sound of sirens pierced the air. It was the shrill, urgent sound of trouble coming from behind. I panicked. I wheeled the car off the main street onto a side road and pulled over onto the curb. I sat there horrified, waiting for them to come after me. My heart pounded like crazy. The sirens grew louder and louder, getting closer and closer. When it seemed they were right up on me, I looked into my rearview mirror in time to see a police car zoom past, its red lights flashing. And then they were gone. I took a deep breath, exhaled, and bowed my head. Why had I been so shaken? I hadn't done anything wrong. I wasn't speeding. Then it struck me. The last time red lights flashed down on me, I wound up doing time. In my head, we were leaving the McDonald's all over again. I was driving this time and the cops were coming from everywhere, preparing to surround the car and close in for the bust. I leaned my forehead on the steering wheel a few minutes, thinking about how scared I felt that night and at this moment. I sat there until I was sure everything was all right. When my heartbeat slowed, I started the car and drove off. Not much had changed with the family since I left, except for Bampoose, who was frail and sickly. I went to visit her in the senior citizens complex across town, where she moved after living in Norfolk for a while. Junie was still away in the Army. Billy was married and still living in New York. My mother was concerned that Dwight, who had been drifting in and out of jobs around Portsmouth since he got out the Army, was dabbling heavily in drugs. He and a strung-out lady friend were busted in the Jeffrey Wilson public housing projects with some works in the car. He was placed on probation. After all the problems Dwight and I had given my parents, they clamped down hard on my youngest brother Brian. 9 years younger than me, he was almost in high school, and my parents barely let him leave the street without permission to go out after dark. Unlike me and Dwight, Brian didn't know diddly squat about the streets. My parents tightened the reins on him so much that my friends joked that if you took him to the other side of Cavalier Manor and left him, he wouldn't know how to find his way back home. I called Liz to make arrangements to see Monroe. Part of me wanted to see her too, to see if maybe we could rekindle our thing. I talked to Liz before leaving the house, but when I made the 15-minute walk to her family's place, it was her mother who answered the door. Liz was gone, she said. I got the message. Monroe was sitting on the living room floor playing with toys. I went in to talk with him, trying to relate to him as best I could, but it felt awkward trying to make conversation with a 5-year-old. Besides, there was still no strong paternal connection. I'd been away for more than half his life. My affection for him felt forced. I could tell he didn't feel connected to me either. He seemed to regard me no differently than he did my brothers. After that visit, I went past the 7-Eleven to check out the scene. Shane and a lot of the old heads were there, hanging around outside the store, sharing a spot along the wall with some new faces I didn't recognize. Many were my peers' baby brothers. Young and brawny, they had that teenage cockiness about them that was once my style. The guys at the store filled me in on everybody and gave me the latest scoop on Scobie D. He was married with a few children and, they said, working at the shipyard. I couldn't imagine Scobe working for somebody, least of all the white man. Working for somebody meant you have to take orders, but he had to eat and feed his family like everyone else. So he had to work and take orders, no matter how bad he was. Even though he was mellowing, Scobe with that flaming red hair and limp wrist was still the baddest cat in Cavalier Manor. Shane told me Scobe had recently fucked up Frank Watford for pissing him off. Scobe had gotten into a beef with Frank at the basketball court behind Waters Junior High. Tall and dark, Frank was a basketball purist who cared less about rumbling than about popping the nets clean with a sweet outside jumper from the top of the key. He loved playing street ball, and he knew the game from way back when. Scobe got mad because Frank was checking him too tight. When Scobe started crying foul, Frank held his ground trying to save face. Just like always, Scobe left to get his gun. When he saw Scobe return with the piece in his hand, Frank made a break for the fence, which was more than 75 yards away, but he wasn't fast enough. Scobe cocked the trigger, took aim, and fired, striking Frank in the back in full view of everybody on the basketball court. Frank was taken to the hospital. He lived and, to everybody's surprise, pressed charges against Scobe. Frank lost the case. Although there had been hundreds of dudes at the basketball court that day, nobody dared to go to trial to back up his story. So Scobe walked and added another notch on his rep. The whole thing blew Frank's mind. Shane said the last time he seen Frank, that nigga was riding a Huffy bike with balloon tires through Cavalier Manor, delivering newspapers. He had a nappy afro and was mumbling to himself. He fucked up in the head now. Shane gave me the lowdown on all the fellas from around our way, including himself. He'd been in and out of jail on lightweight bids. Nutbringer and Charlie Gregg were around, he said, but they'd been low-key since they got out the joint. Most of the others, including Shell Shock, Lep, Frog Dicky, and Bimbo, were unemployed or working at the shipyard. Shane said the drug game was changing. You can't even get a good 4-finger ounce no more. A half an ounce costs you $35. After we talked a while, Shane looked me up and down as if noticing me for the first time. So, my man, what's up with you? Not much, man. I'm trying to find a job until I can start college. That's cool. You want to go to Broadway Club with me Friday night? I paused before answering. And that was a challenge I knew would come, to hang with the fellas or not to hang. I wanted to stay away from the old spots. I knew the gang would want to hang out, get high, and do some crazy shit for old time's sake. But I didn't want to get into any of that. At the same time, I didn't want the fellas to say I'd change. On the streets, they treat it like something bad if you hang with them, then change and start doing something different. They get a complex and start thinking that maybe you think you're better than them. If I didn't hang, I knew what they would say about me. I knew how Shane would run it down to some of the others. Yeah, man, that nigga done changed. He talking proper, using big words and shit. That nigga done gone off to the penitentiary and got grand on us. Think he too good to hang with his boys. But I couldn't be too concerned with what anybody said. I had grown. I wanted to keep moving ahead in life and not even think about falling back into the old groove that had once had my head so messed up. So I turned down Shane's offer. Then there was this strange silence. There was nothing else to talk about. When we both realized that, we split. Actually, I didn't know where to go or what to do for fun, beyond the things I used to do. I kept a low profile. Yvette, the school friend who visited me in prison, became my haven. A dark-skinned, brown-eyed beauty with prominent cheekbones and an infectious smile. Yvette told me she had a crush on me in high school but stayed away after I hooked up with Liz because she thought I preferred red bones. I've since learned from a lot of dark-skinned sisters that they had complexes about their complexion when they were young. Yvette and I spent a lot of time together talking in my parents' den. She sought refuge in me from her mother, who cursed her out whenever they disagreed. I sought refuge in her because I had given up my old life and had nothing to replace it with. I was grateful to her for being there, but besides her, there was no one to talk to. No one as stimulating as some of the brothers I met in the joint. I was sure there were many intelligent, progressive people out there somewhere, but I had no idea where they were or how to find them. It was weird and I felt lonely. My parole officer was a cockeyed young white guy with a big watermelon head and thin, stringy hair that he combed from one side of his head all the way across the top to cover his bald spot. Right away, I resented him. I resented the whole notion of being on parole. I felt I paid my debt to society, or whoever the hell felt they were owed, and that slate should be squeaky clean. During our first meeting, my PO lectured me about what I could and couldn't do. It was humiliating and made me feel like a child. I had to report to him once a month. I couldn't own a firearm. I couldn't vote. I couldn't travel outside the immediate area without his written permission. Finally, putting on his best stern-faced look, he added, "And you're not to associate with other ex-felons." I wanted to slap my knee and laugh in that white man's face. I wanted to say, "Motherfucker, you may as well ship me to the desert to live, 'cause half the niggas in Portsmouth are ex-felons." But I didn't say it. I kept quiet and nodded my head, signaling that I understood. Right away, my PO pressured me to find a job. He said I have to report to him weekly until I got employed. That was incentive enough to get hustling. The problem was, he also told me, I was required by law to tell the truth on job applications. If they asked, I had to tell I was a convicted felon. I hit the streets hard, starting with applications to area print shops. Armed with my offset printing and lithography certificate, I went in feeling confident that I could talk knowledgeably about any phase of the printing process, and I did. At one point, a print shop in Norfolk was set to bring me on. They had openings. The interview went extremely well. The fleshly-faced shop supervisor was smiling at me big time. "You'll like it here. You'll do just fine." Then as I sat there, he scanned my application. His big blue eyes stopped near the bottom, the section where they asked, "Have you ever been convicted of a felony?" I had put yes in that section. The supervisor looked at me, turned the application my way, pointed at that section and said, "What's this about?" "Well, I was convicted of armed robbery and served 3 years. I'm out on parole." I heard the words as if they'd been spoken by someone else. The supervisor played it off like it was no big deal. Then he went into that "we'll call you" mode and walked me to the door. I knew it was over. I knew I'd never hear from him again, and I didn't. Several times I missed out on plum printing jobs like that one, jobs that I really wanted, all the same because I came clean about my record. It didn't make me feel good about telling the truth, especially to white folks. Most blacks understand that a brother with a rap sheet is commonplace, like being circumcised. But white folks take that shit to heart. They don't understand, and they don't forgive. Job hunting is expensive. The little money I saved from working in prison was gone in no time. I had to rely on my parents for bus fare. My pride wouldn't let me ask them for much. I walked wherever I could, but most places I went were not within walking distance. The frustration of going from door to door to businesses in Norfolk and Portsmouth brought to mind a line about job hunting in a rendition of Inner City Blues by Gil Scott-Heron. Walk a bit whole in a brand new pair of shoes, and you had your first look at the Inner City Blues. Every time I filled out an application and ran across that section about felony convictions, it made me feel sick inside. I felt like getting up and walking out on the spot. What was the use? I knew what they were going to do. No white folks would hire me. It was bad enough that I was black. A black man with a felony record didn't stand a chance, no matter how many trade certificates or degrees he had. The thing that irritated me most was that everywhere I went, it seemed white folks were always asking if they could help me. Every time I walked into a store or into a building, white people rushed up to me before I could get in the door and asked, "May I help you?" They'd look at me like I was a germ, like they thought I was there to steal something or stick up the place. "May I help you?" They always said it loud enough to make other people stop and stare. I knew the deal. That was their way of alerting everybody else. That was their way of announcing, "Beware, there's a black man in here." It still pisses me off now when white folks rush up to me and ask, "May I help you?" Hell, they were doing everything in their power to hold me back. When they asked if they could help me back then, I wanted to cuss them out. I wanted to say, "Yeah, motherfucker, you can help me. Help me get a job." Seeing how frustrated I was getting, my parents suggested that I get away for a while. So I went to Washington, D.C. to job hunt. There, I lived with the family of one of my father's old Navy buddies. I wandered around downtown D.C., applying for jobs at print shops and other places. It felt refreshing being in the city where nobody knew me. In D.C., I didn't have a street image to contend with. I had a clean slate, but that comfort didn't last long. After a few weeks, I ran out of money and had to return home and start my job search there again. Over time, the frustration worsened. My P.O. kept bugging me, and I stayed broke all the time. There was nothing to give Liz for child support. Every now and then, she'd make some sarcastic remark about me not doing anything for my son. For a while, I stopped going around to see Monroe because I was so ashamed that I had no money. I couldn't even afford to take Yvette to see a movie. With no money, no car, no apartment, I began to feel like less of a man, like I was a grown child dependent on my parents. My self-esteem started slipping. Every day I got more uptight and madder at the world. One day while driving my stepfather's car, I pulled into the drive-in window of the Burger King on Victory Boulevard. I ordered, "Give me a fish sandwich, fries, and a shake." The server, a white man who appeared to be in his mid-20s, hurriedly took the order, handed me the food, and shut the window. I needed more change. I waited as the server spoke on the intercom, apparently taking orders from the other customers driving in behind me. Noticing I was still there waiting, he frowned and opened the window to see what I wanted. I could tell he was annoyed. I asked, "Could you give me change for a 10, please?" Without saying a word, the clerk clucked his tongue in disgust, snatched the $10 bill from my hand, and slammed the window shut. After changing the bill from the cash register, he opened the window and all but threw the money back at me. Quarters dropped from my hand and landed in my lap. The clerk rolled his eyes, slammed the window shut again, and waited for me to leave. That old fire, the fire I used to feel all the time before I went to prison, resurfaced, and blood rushed hot to my head. Before I knew it, I sped the car away from the drive-in window and wheeled into a nearby parking space. I jumped out of the car, bolted through the front door of the Burger King, and leapt onto the front counter. All the nerves in my body had readied for battle. Just as I was about to swing my legs across the counter, a black store manager stepped forward and held his hands aloft and spoke pleadingly. "Be cool, brother. Be cool. Those few words, spoken in a soft, sincere tone that suggested that he understood, was enough to make me stop long enough to reconsider my actions. I got off the counter and stood there, breathing heavily. Customers and other Burger King employees stopped and stared. The white server, his eyes wide, stood back behind the manager. I glared into his eyes and felt hatred seething in my soul. I wanted him bad. I wanted him bad enough to risk 30 days in jail. By then, I was feeling that if I could get across that counter and reach that white boy, I would try to knock his teeth through the back of his head. I'd punch him in his face and slam his head against the ice cream machine so hard he'd have nightmares about me the rest of his life. Looking at the manager, I pointed at the white boy and said, "You better teach that punk how to treat people." Then I turned and stormed out of the store. I'd read somewhere that 85% of inmates return to prison within 5 years of being released. Just about all the guys I knew who'd gotten out were returning so fast it seemed that they had been home on furlough rather than parole. Bonaparte stuck up at a restaurant and was wounded during a shootout with the law. Another dude went back on an armed robbery beef shortly after he got out. I'd heard Pearly Blue died in prison of hepatitis. Jim, who's living about 90 miles away in Richmond, was the only person who seemed to be doing all right for himself. He'd found a job and had used the money he'd embezzled from Southampton to buy a small house and a brand new sports car. I knew I had to work hard to reach the 5-year mark, and yet as the harshness of the outside world started taking a toll, fears began dancing around in my head. Doubts seeped in. All the spiritual and philosophical principles I had studied in prison seemed to go out the window when contending with the reality of that white man's world. Oddly, there were times when I actually missed the solitude and security of prison. For 3 years, I hadn't hardly had to deal with racism. It hadn't mattered whether or not white people gave me a job. I was guaranteed work in prison, and I had a place to eat and sleep, 3 hots and a cot. I wonder if Bone and some of the others who'd gone back had subconsciously found ways to get busted because things got too heavy for them out in the world. I wonder if I might mess around and do the same. I read about the power of the subconscious, and I believed it was true. I figured that if I went back to the joint for anything, it would be for going off on some white person for assaulting me. But there was always the possibility of getting busted on a humble, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was determined not to let anything like that happen. But every now and then I wondered about it and got uptight and started thinking that it just might happen if I didn't get a better grip. One night, while driving my stepfather's car, I stopped at a convenience store. It was located on a small, deserted street. It was late, and there was only one attendant in the store. While I browsed, he went to the back room to get something. When I went to the counter, I noted, "There's no one else here. No customers, no cameras." When the clerk returned, I made my purchase and went back to the car. I climbed in and sat there a moment thinking. I looked up and down the street, and there was no one in sight. I thought, I could take this place by myself. I could stick my hand in my coat like I've got a gun and take this place. I've been doing that a lot lately. I'd enter stores, case them, and assess my chances of being able to pull off another job. Just one job, no more. All I need is some funds to tide me over until I can find work. Just this one time. Every person who ever did time can tell you what he did wrong to get caught. Everyone feels that all he has to do is rectify that one mental error and he's on his way. I knew what had gone wrong in the McDonald's stick-up. We hadn't planned carefully. I knew I could do it right this time. I sat there for a long while struggling inside my head. It was a real rumble between right and wrong. It was a struggle that on the surface didn't make sense, an internal battle that should not have been taking place in light of all I had suffered and learned from prison. And yet, there I was, thinking about making another hit. Sitting there in the car, I thought my plan through like a chess match. I envisioned the job step by step and mapped out my getaway route. Then I thought about something else. I remembered that I had something that most cats coming out the joint did not. I had supportive parents. I thought about my mother and stepfather, who had suffered through 3 years of hell with me from start to finish. I thought about how hard they pulled for me since I had gotten out. They gave me money. I had a place to lay my head. They let me use their car. They cared about me. They cared about me. I couldn't let them down. I thought about something else too. The lessons about perseverance I learned in the joint. I learned about the strength of the mind and seeing that mental toughness, more than brawn, determines who survives and who buckles. When I left prison, I knew I was armed with a different kind of weapon than I had relied on before going in. I had knowledge. I started the car and drove away. Okay, that brings us to the end of chapter 24. And just a few thoughts that I'm having. Why is it that when we try to better ourselves, you have to worry about the people that you know, thinking that you're changing to, I don't know, like thinking that you're changing is almost as if it's a slight to them. Like when you're no longer interested in the old things that you were into and you want to, do better for yourself. Some people take offense to that. Honestly, I think that's more of an insecurity type of thing than anything else. But let me know in the comments, is that something that you run across when you thought about improving yourself or started taking steps to improve yourself? People start looking at you differently. I think each level of life requires like a different version of yourself in a sense. You should always be trying to improve. Another thing that made me that I was thinking about in this book is the idea that you see people who are in and out of jail a lot. Like they get out, do something wrong, go back in, get out, do something wrong, go back in. And like that process just happens back and forth. But reading this chapter made me think about something like, well, maybe they're doing that because, they're having such a hard time trying to make it out in the real world. It's like if you make a mistake, they never let you forget that mistake that you made. It's something that stays with you. And it's also this idea that, when you're black, you really can't afford to make any mistakes because it is such a hard thing to get off your record or, not have to carry around with you the rest of your life. They only see the mistake. They like to remember you at your lowest. And that's something else to think about when interacting with people or even when you're thinking about people. A lot of times, things that pop up in our mind are something bad that happened to them or something wrong that they did. Maybe that's human nature. Maybe that's what we've been programmed to do, to remember the worst about somebody before we remember the good. But anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Ron's Library and Ideas, and I'll see y'all in the next chapter.